Typically, on How You Came to Be, we explore the lives of those who were fortunate enough to live in single-family homes, or whose descendants became some of today's most successful people. But what about those who were lost, mentally or physically? Those who didn't have a home or a supportive family, and who were unable to cope with the burdens of life in the early 20th century. In this video, we will delve into the lives of 4 individuals who were patients at Danvers State Lunatic Hospital in 1910, and the circumstances of their lives that may have led them to spend much of their lives in asylums. With insights from the past, perhaps we can respond to the ongoing discussion surrounding mental health and how to help those in need. In 1874, the state of Massachusetts purchased 500 acres of oak, pine, and apple groves with the intent to build a mental health facility in the town of Danvers, 25 miles north of Boston. Up to this point, caring for the mentally ill was managed at a local level, but population growth from waves of European immigration required states to step in to ease the local burden. Thomas Kirkbride, the founder of the American Psychiatric Association, developed a care plan for state hospitals, which was adopted by over 30 states. It required buildings to be constructed on over 100 acres of land of either stone or brick, with wings that flanked the central administration building and composed of 8 wards, with the most excited patients housed at the ends. The complex would also provide housing for staff and offer ample outdoor space and elaborate gardens. Danvers was a prime example of a Kirkbride complex and offered the most progressive psychiatric treatment available. The hospital was built with the intent of curing the mentally ill. Patients were given occupational therapy by tending the farm and greenhouses, digging tunnels, and constructing small buildings. They made shoes and crafts that were sold at exhibitions, and the community would often donate books, magazines, and flowers. By 1912, the hospital housed over 1,200 people, 2,000 people by 1920, and over 2,300 people by 1939, far exceeding its original capacity of 450, which undoubtedly affected patient care and comfort. Eventually, Danvers Lunatic Hospital became known for patients walking naked through the halls, where shock therapy and straitjackets were typical, and as the birthplace of prefrontal lobotomies, where brain connectivity is physically severed, permanently dulling a patient's emotional response, leaving those who survived shells of their former selves. It is images like these that make abandoned asylums so ominous. It is the fear that someone who is maybe a bit odd or unusual, perhaps not unlike ourselves, held against their will, surrounded by the truly insane, and forced to endure horrible, ineffective therapies until death, but then, still lost, they continue to roam the empty halls for all time. My mother briefly worked at what became known as Danvers State Hospital in the late 1960s at the age of 18, and it had a profound effect on her. She knew several people who had gotten jobs there because, as a state-run facility, no state taxes were taken out of their paychecks, which enticed many young people. She worked in the Bonner Medical Building, not the main psychiatric ward, likely because she was so young, 5 feet 2 inches and less than 110 pounds. She was not physically capable of working with the unpredictable patients. When she arrived, she saw a large room full of elderly people, many sitting in wheelchairs. The smell of urine was pungent. It was here that most of the psychiatric patients were sent to spend their final days. She was unaware of it at the time, but her own grandmother Florence died here just 5 years earlier. Danvers State served as a low-income nursing home. Florence was abandoned by her husband and raised 2 daughters on her own during the Great Depression. Neither of her children were capable of caring for her as she aged, so being poor and with no other family, she spent her last year at Danvers State, until her death from heart failure in 1963. It was probably best that my mother not know the details of her grandmother's final year, as it would have made her experience even more difficult. She was typically tasked with changing bed linens. Soon she was asked to feed a patient, but instructed not to put her hand too close to the person's mouth. When she entered the room, she found a teenage girl about her age wearing a football helmet in bed. The nonverbal adolescent would bang her head violently and had to be protected with the helmet. She spoon-fed the girl what looked like dog food. The girl ate voraciously, exposing a mouthful of rotted teeth, and if not careful, she would bite. Beneath the sheets, the girl's legs were stick-thin, her hair matted, a distant look in her eyes. Perhaps the staff thought it would be helpful for this young woman to be served by someone her own age, but for my mother it was devastating to see someone so young in that state. Every day my mother went home crying, overwhelmed by the sadness and suffering. Within a week her father made her quit, but as the years passed and the building slowly deteriorated, she wondered what became of the property. My mother and I often drove by Danvers State, its Gothic spires visible for miles atop that hill, an ominous warning of where life can lead. She always said she would take me there someday so I could see the abandoned building myself. So one fall afternoon in 1998, as we drove by, she unexpectedly turned into the driveway. She and I watched enough horror movies together to be intrigued by what dark secrets the long-abandoned hospital might reveal. We were shocked to find the gates wide open, beckoning us to venture further. We drove up the windy, tree-lined driveway. I still remember the rusted stop sign that we passed, and I wondered how many people saw that sign as they drove in, some for the last time. We made our way through the property and parked in front of the administration building. It was late afternoon, the sun shining low in the sky. I remember looking up at the building, and on that top floor, this window was broken, as many were, with a ripped and tattered curtain blowing in the wind. It is this image that still gives me chills, the remnants of lives long forgotten. We peeked inside one of the broken windows on the ground floor. It was a stairwell, the light green leaded paint peeling off the walls. We didn't go inside, but as we stood there alone, I expect my mother was flooded with memories of when this place was teeming with people. We didn't stay more than 20 minutes, not wanting to tempt whatever might be lurking at night. We drove back down the windy driveway to find the metal gate that had ushered us in, closed and locked. We had not seen a single person during our visit, but somehow we were trapped. My mother was panicked, and we were not avid trespassers, but it was not altogether shocking that the one time we did would not end well. It felt like we were in a movie, though it was unclear if it was a comedy or a horror film. We drove back through the grounds and found the maintenance complex. There a man yelled, "You're not supposed to be here!" I can't tell you what he looked like other than that he appeared to be living. We explained that we were trying to leave, but the gate was closed. He admonished us not to come back, and we followed him back down to the gate, which he unlocked, and we escaped. Despite the fact that much of the complex has been demolished and is now a suburban apartment community, this experience is forever etched into my mind. The feelings of sadness and hopelessness that I felt as I peered up into the same windows that others gazed out of longingly, I believe were channeled from the thousands of souls who were condemned here for decades. But who were they? Charles Wesley Dolan was born June 20th, 1888 in Wakefield, Massachusetts. He was the fourth child of John Dolan and Margaret Curran, who were both Irish immigrants. John was born in 1854 in Tullow, Ireland. He emigrated from Ireland in 1867, but at some point he returned and married Margaret Curran. John and Margaret gave birth to son John in 1880 before emigrating back to the U.S. in 1881. In 1888, at the time of Charles's birth, John worked at the rattan factory, which produced wicker furniture, trolley seats, and baby carriages. There he worked 50 to 55 hours a week for mere pennies on the dollar. John and Margaret welcomed daughter Annie in 1883, son Thomas in 1885, Charles in 1888, and son Joseph in 1889. Sadly, Joseph, who was separated from Charles by only 15 months, died just after his first birthday on October 7, 1890, from marasmus, which is infant malnutrition. It could be caused by a medical condition, but more likely it was the result of poverty and maternal malnutrition, as Margaret had multiple births in such a short period of time. John and Margaret's child, also named Margaret, was born March 16, 1893. 3 days later, Mother Margaret passed away from septemia, which is a blood infection, likely a complication of giving birth. She was 36 years old. With the loss of Margaret, John was left to care for 5 children, ages 10 to newborn. However, baby Margaret would not survive long without her mother. She passed away September 2nd, 1893, at just 5 months of age from meningitis. Meningitis often starts with a high fever, stiff neck, and headache. Today, meningitis is treatable with antibiotics, but in the late 19th century, it was deadly. In the 1900 U.S. Census, we see John Dolan and his 4 children living in Wakefield, Massachusetts. John and his 2 oldest sons were working at the rattan factory. Charles was in school, and Annie was living at home. All were able to read and write, but within days of this census, tragedy would strike again. 17-year-old Annie died of acute miliary tuberculosis on June 17, 1900. She likely had mild symptoms initially, but the bacteria spread and infected her lungs. Charles watched as his teenage sister, the one who likely cared for him since his mother's death, gasped for air and coughed up blood, wasting away. What lasting impact could such images have on the mind of a 12-year-old boy? There are no newspaper articles about Charles Dolan, so there is no indication of criminality. But by 1910, 22-year-old Charles was a patient at Danvers State Hospital. According to the 1910 annual report for Danvers State, there was an increase of 59 patients for the year, bringing the total to 1,483. The average age at admission was 43 years old, and the average duration of insanity before arrival was 2 years. 44% were foreign-born, and 64% had foreign parentage. Like the Dolans, many of whom made the arduous trip overseas to America in the early 20th century, and who were allowed entry into the country, passing rigorous physical examination, and deemed capable of supporting themselves, within 1 generation were the majority of commitments to Danvers State Hospital. The hardships of immigration are often overlooked by those of us who are descended from European immigrants, but for those who never had descendants, their struggles are lost to time. Only 19% of those admitted in 1910 were ever expected to recover, and many of those were expected to relapse. Among men, the principal causes for admission were alcoholism and syphilis. Syphilis is a bacterial STD that involves 3 stages of infection. The initial stage involves open sores on the skin. Some people go on to develop a second stage of illness characterized by rash, fever, and headache, while many will continue with a symptom-free infection. Regardless of symptoms, most will eventually develop late-stage syphilis, 1 to 30 years after infection, which affects the bones and organs, including the brain, leading to memory loss, mood changes, and dementia. It was these late-stage syphilis patients who roamed these halls and peered out these windows, once vibrant, active people who had no history of mental illness. By 1930, 44-year-old Charles was back in his hometown of Wakefield, living in what was known as the town farm, seen here, which was essentially a poorhouse. Town farms offered a family atmosphere compared to the sterility of an institution such as Danvers State. I think Charles's relocation to a town farm indicates that he was not prone to violence and was somewhat capable of self-care. He continued living at the Wakefield town farm until his death in 1940. Ida B. Joy was also a patient at Danvers State Hospital in 1910. Ida was born October 29, 1875 in Lawrence, Massachusetts, to Ephraim and Naomi Joy. Ephraim's occupation was listed as a peddler, a traveling seller of goods, which does not conjure images of a stable income capable of supporting a growing family. Ephraim and Naomi were both born in Maine. They were married January 5, 1865, and had 6 children, one of whom died in infancy. Here we see the family in the 1880 U.S. Census, where Ephraim is listed as being a laborer. By 1893, Ephraim and Naomi had moved to New Hampshire, but all of their children remained in Massachusetts, with sisters Hattie, Lizzie, and Ida living together in Beverly, 1 town over from Danvers. Ida worked as a shoemaker for many years. On April 5, 1898, Ida welcomed a daughter, Lottie Chadbourne Joy. Ida was 22 years old and did not list a father on the birth record. We do not know the circumstances of Lottie's birth, but a young woman raising a child alone at the turn of the 20th century was undoubtedly difficult. By 1900, Ida was living with her daughter and her sister Hattie in Beverly and working as a housekeeper. City directories indicate that Ida and Hattie lived together until 1903. Hattie continued to appear in Beverly City directories, but Ida disappeared until 1910 when she was a patient at Danvers State. What happened? According to the annual report, the most common occupations for those admitted in 1910 were laborers and shoemakers for men, and housewife or housekeeper for women. 100 of the 194 women admitted in 1910 had unknown causes for their mental illness, a suspiciously large percentage. If there was no identifiable cause, why was a woman sent to Danvers State? There are several examples of women being sent away by husbands and family members without just cause. How many sane women were held at Danvers State against their will? Of the diagnosed women, 11% were held for alcoholism and another 11% for overwork and worry. 23% had a constitutional defect, which essentially means that she was born with a difficult personality, which could fall into several categories, including sensitive, schizoid, hysterical, compulsive, or paranoid. Unlike Charles, who had no occupation during his time at Danvers State, Ida was tasked with laundry, so she was physically capable. From 1920 to 1940, Ida was a patient at Foxborough State Hospital. She no longer did laundry and was never identified as having a child. I wonder if Ida was unable to say she had a daughter or if she did not want to. I could not find Lottie in the 1910 census, but she was married in 1916 at the age of 18. On her marriage license, she gives the name Carol for her father, indicating that she knew who he was. Despite not having her mother, Lottie went on to have 3 daughters of her own and died at the age of 72. I was not able to find an exact date of death for Ida, but she died sometime in the 1940s and outlived both her sister Hattie, who died in 1912 from gangrenous appendicitis, and her brother George, who died of cardiac disease in 1914. It seems that the care and treatment Ida received inside state hospitals was better than the conditions outside. Rebecca Lyons was also a patient at Danvers State in 1910, and she and Ida may have been acquainted. Rebecca was born January 17, 1876 in Marblehead, Massachusetts, to John and Sally Lyons. Here we see the family in 1880 with their 4 children, with John listed as a fisherman and his 14-year-old son William as a fish peddler. Sally Lyons died on December 3, 1889, at the age of 51 of tuberculosis, the same disease that claimed the life of Charles Dolan's teenage sister. We are now seeing some similarities between these patients, which leads to some interesting questions. Does exposure to illnesses such as tuberculosis or meningitis as a child affect mental health later in life? Or does watching someone you love waste away from a debilitating disease at a young age have a profound effect on some individuals? Also, both Rebecca and Charles lost their mothers in childhood, Charles at the age of 5 and Rebecca at the age of 12. The loss of a parent is devastating for any child, but the lack of child care resources and emotional and physical support in the late 19th century likely exacerbated the loss. Could these events be the precursors to a life of mental illness? But Rebecca was able to overcome these struggles, at least for a time. In the 1900 U.S. Census, we see John Lyons and all of his adult children still living at home. It is rare that in 1900 4 adult children would still be living at home and not married with growing families of their own. It may simply indicate that the family was happy together and enjoyed the stability of John owning their home, or that there were issues that prevented them from marrying. Rebecca worked as a stenographer, which required knowledge, training, and skill, and a seemingly promising future. Then, in the 1903 Marblehead City Directory, Rebecca is suddenly listed as being removed to Colorado. In the 1905 City Directory, Rebecca is listed as removed from town. I was not able to find any records of her in Colorado, or any newspaper articles indicating criminal behavior. But removal indicates force and unwillingness, which her family was a part of. What would lead a young woman with a steady job to be sent away so suddenly? Did something tragic happen and she had a breakdown? Did she have a temperament that prevented her from marrying, which eventually led to her removal? By 1920, Rebecca was living at Medfield State Hospital, which housed long-term, high-need patients. Rebecca lived at Medfield Hospital for over 30 years. She never again held a job. On September 8, 1951, 75-year-old Rebecca fell out of bed and fractured her hip. Just 2 months later, she passed away from heart disease, here at Medfield State Hospital. Medfield State was built in 1892 and offered a picturesque, college-like campus, at one time housing 2,000 patients. The abandoned property is one of the only asylums to currently be open to the public, a top TripAdvisor destination for the town of Medfield, a place where visitors can be immersed in all the feelings and emotions that the hospital represents and pay respects to those who never left. Our last patient at Danvers State has the most compelling story. Victor Castagnoy was born in March 1887 in New York to John and Sophie Castagnoy, who were French-Canadian immigrants from Quebec. It appears that the family came to the U.S. at the time of Victor's birth, but returned to Canada shortly thereafter, as we see them in the Canadian census of 1891. The family came back to the U.S. in 1898. In the 1900 U.S. Census, we see the family living in Methuen, Massachusetts, with John working on a farm. Notably, 3 of Victor's older siblings from the 1891 census, who I would have expected to accompany the family, were not listed in 1900 and likely passed away, though I was mysteriously unable to find any records of their deaths. In 1909, an interesting story arose. A body was found on a path near the Castagnoy home of a 32-year-old man named Joseph Eno. Joseph had visited John Castagnoy over the winter and was allegedly headed back to the family's house when he became exhausted and fell into the bushes and died. Joseph's death certificate declares that he died of exposure and natural causes. But could forensics in 1909 accurately determine the cause of death of a badly decomposed body? I wonder how much effort would be put forth to investigate a homeless man's death. And why would a dying man go into the bushes? Wouldn't he be visibly trying to get help? It is possible that Victor was already at Danvers State in 1909, and that even if he was living at home, that this was just an unusual turn of events that he had nothing to do with. But it is impossible to overlook the implications. We see from his World War I draft card that Victor, who was of medium height and slender build, with brown hair and blue eyes, was transferred from Danvers State to Tewksbury State Hospital on March 1, 1911, and was legally committed as insane. I have not encountered a story of a suspicious death on any of the other properties I have researched. That is, until the death occurs just steps from the home of a young man who was declared insane. There is no indication that the police ever investigated Victor, and at the time of Eno's death, Victor may have had no signs of mental illness. But as hindsight is 20/20, we can't ignore the possibility that this vagrant man died at the hands of Victor. Despite never being connected to Joseph Eno's death, Victor spent the rest of his life in asylums until his death in 1952. These are just a few of hundreds of thousands of stories of people who worked or were patients at asylums around the world. For many of the individuals on the 1910 Danvers State Census, I could not even find enough public records to piece together their lives. They only existed here. Of the 4 individuals we explored, there were some interesting observations. The lasting impacts of immigration, including lost connections to people and places now oceans away, financial struggles despite countless hours of work, loss of children and parents from malnutrition and illness, all seemingly broken promises for a better life, which overwhelmed many. Regardless of immigration status, some found comfort in a bottle, others were exposed to a sexually transmitted disease before they even knew that it existed, condemned to spend their final days here suffering, possibly because of one poor decision. Some were subjected to inhumane treatment, but for others, like Ida B. Joy, whose siblings died decades before she did, life inside was less perilous than life outside. So what would life look like for Charles, Ida, Rebecca, and Victor today? We no longer house the mentally ill on 500 acres of land in beautifully constructed buildings. We treat them with drugs, legal and illegal, and allow them to live in tents on the street until they end up in jail. Or in some U.S. cities, we now allow, and in some cases encourage, criminal behavior, drugs, theft, and vagrancy without consequence, putting the rest of society at risk. Addressing poverty must be a cornerstone of mental health programs because regardless of whether poverty breeds mental illness or families who live in poverty have a predisposal to mental illness, these families need the tools to cope with and overcome their circumstances. We will never fully eliminate mental illness or poverty. They are products of a fallen society. But Charles, Ida, Rebecca, and Victor needed support in childhood when the seeds of mental illness take root. We need to invest in our children and provide support and encouragement at home and in school. My mother always told me that life was hard and that it can throw things at you that you never expect. But when it gets you down, remember all the people who came before you and all the people who need you now. Get up and try again.